The sun rose slowly over the jungle, bleeding red into the mist. The air smelled of smoke and salt, a strange silence hovering where once there had been laughter. Manila was burning. American forces were retreating, and the Japanese army had swept through the Philippines like a storm that refused to stop. Among the chaos stood Lieutenant Mary Harrington, an army nurse barely 24, clutching a medical bag that felt heavier than her own body. Around her, the wounded groaned in the ruins of what had been a field hospital. Planes still roared overhead. The war had come closer than she ever imagined. She had volunteered 2 years earlier, full of spirit and duty. She dreamed of helping soldiers, of saving lives. But now the world had turned into something unrecognizable, a world where mercy was a luxury and survival was an act of defiance. When the surrender came in 1942, it wasn't with ceremony or dignity. The U.S. and Filipino troops laid down their weapons, hands trembling, faces hollow. The nurses were ordered to remain behind, protected personnel, the Japanese called them. But everyone knew what that really meant. The trucks arrived at dawn. The nurses, more than 70 American women, were herded into them under armed guard. They were taken north, past burned villages and silent rivers, until they reached a compound surrounded by barbed wire and palm trees, Santo Tomas internment camp. It had once been a university. Now it was a prison. The nurses were forced into overcrowded rooms. Food was scarce, watery rice twice a day. Water, often contaminated. They built makeshift hospitals with scraps, tore their uniforms into bandages, and used empty tin cans to sterilize instruments. Every day, soldiers brought in the sick, prisoners, civilians, even enemy soldiers sometimes, and Mary treated them all, because that's what she was trained to do. At night, the sounds of the jungle filled the silence. Crickets, distant gunfire, and sometimes the low cries of the dying. Mary learned to sleep sitting upright, ready to jump if guards burst in. Weeks turned into months. The nurses worked without medicine, without rest. Malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition spread like wildfire. The once vibrant young women were now ghosts in torn uniforms, faces sunken, eyes hollow yet fierce. Still, they refused to give up. They called themselves the Angels of Bataan. Each morning, Mary would whisper to herself, "I am still here." It was her prayer, her weapon, her reminder that survival itself was resistance. One evening, a young soldier was carried into the infirmary. He was barely alive, his body broken by weeks of torture. The guards wanted him treated. He had information they needed. Mary's hands shook as she cleaned his wounds. The man whispered something in Tagalog, then pressed a crumpled note into her hand when the guard wasn't looking. "For the Americans," he said. That night, under the dim glow of a smuggled lantern, she read the note. It contained coordinates, hidden Allied supply drops somewhere in the mountains. If the message reached the resistance, hundreds of lives could be saved. Mary faced a choice that could cost her everything. If caught, she'd be executed. But if she didn't act, men and women would die in the jungles waiting for medicine that would never come. At dawn, during her shift at the gate hospital, she slipped the note into the bandage of a Filipino messenger boy who delivered supplies for the guards. She whispered one word, "Run." He nodded and disappeared into the crowd. Days passed in silence. Then faint explosions echoed in the distance. Allied planes had hit a Japanese convoy carrying stolen medical supplies. The message had reached them. Mary didn't smile. She didn't celebrate, but she felt something deep inside. not victory, but a small, stubborn flicker of hope. By 1943, starvation had become their greatest enemy. The women's weights dropped to barely 100 pounds. They cut their hair short to fight lice. When they weren't treating others, they scavenged for leaves, boiled roots, and prayed for rain. Yet through it all, they kept their hospital running. They sang softly to patients, shared food when they had none to spare, and took turns reading Bible verses from memory. One day, a guard dragged in a fellow nurse, Helen. She had been caught stealing rice from the kitchen. The punishment was brutal. The women were forced to watch as she was beaten unconscious. Mary knelt beside her afterward, pressing a cool cloth to her bruised face. "You're still here," she whispered. "That's what matters." The Japanese commander noticed the nurses' defiance. Their calm unnerved him. Women who refused to break even when everything was taken from them. So he made an example of their courage. He ordered them to treat his wounded officers in exchange for extra rations. It was meant to humiliate them, but they turned it into strength, using those scraps of food to save dying prisoners instead. Mary's journal entries, written secretly on cigarette paper, would later reveal the unimaginable. She wrote, "We are not heroes. We are survivors. We bleed quietly and we endure loudly. That is how we fight." One humid evening, she found a child crying near the fence. The little girl's mother had died days earlier, and no one had the strength to bury her. Mary lifted the child into her arms and sang softly, her voice cracked and dry. She didn't know why she sang. Maybe to remind herself she was still human. By late 1944, gunfire began to echo from the hills again. Rumors spread. The Americans were coming back. Liberation was close. The guards grew nervous, crueler, desperate. Executions became frequent. Yet in the darkest moments, Mary and the others stood taller than ever. When the first American tanks rolled into Manila in early 1945, the prisoners at Santo Tomas were barely recognizable. Skin and bones, eyes hollow but still alive. The soldiers who entered the camp froze in disbelief. They had heard rumors of the nurses, but nothing prepared them for the sight of 70 women standing at attention, uniforms in tatters, saluting with trembling hands. Mary wept for the first time in years. Not for herself, but for the faces she didn't see. Helen, the boy who ran with the message, and the patients who never made it home. The war was over, but some scars never healed. Years later, when asked how she survived, she quietly said, "We didn't survive, we endured, and that's not the same thing." The sound of engines grew louder. Dust and smoke rose above the camp walls. For a moment, no one dared to move, afraid it might be another cruel trick. Then the gates burst open. American soldiers rushed in, weapons raised, eyes wide with disbelief. What they saw was something no man could ever forget. Women in tattered uniforms stood silently, too weak to cheer. Their faces were pale, their hands trembling, but in their eyes burned something stronger than fear: survival. Mary Harrington stood among them, barely recognizable. Her frame was thin, her hair shorn, her lips cracked from dehydration. Yet she smiled. After 3 long years, she had finally seen the flag again. One of the soldiers stepped forward and whispered, "Ma'am, we're here to take you home." Her knees buckled, but she didn't cry. Tears felt like a luxury from another life. The camp was chaos. Men and women stumbled toward freedom, clutching one another like ghosts who had forgotten what sunlight felt like. Some fell to their knees, kissing the ground. Others simply stared, too shocked to believe it was real. Mary turned back toward the hospital hut one last time. The beds were empty, sheets stained, walls carved with names of the lost. She ran her hand across the wood, over words etched by her own knife. Still here. The journey home was harder than anyone expected. The nurses were flown to a hospital ship anchored in Manila Bay. Doctors lined the deck, ready to receive them. When Mary stepped aboard, a young medic froze. He'd never seen a soldier salute like that, weak, trembling, but proud. "Welcome home, Lieutenant," he said softly. For days, the women were treated like heroes, yet none of them felt that way. They'd lost too much. Every night, Mary would wake up screaming, hearing phantom footsteps, the clang of metal gates. She would reach for her lamp, only to realize she was safe, far from the camp. When they reached San Francisco weeks later, crowds waited at the docks. Families, journalists, flags waving. But as Mary stepped off the ship, she saw empty faces. The ones she had saved weren't there. The ones who hadn't made it home never would be. Reporters rushed forward, asking questions. "What kept you alive? What was the hardest part?" She answered none of them. She just whispered, "We were nurses. We took care of everyone." She returned to her hometown in Kansas, a quiet place where the war felt like a distant story, but for her, it never ended. Loud noises made her flinch. Rain against tin sounded like gunfire. The smell of rice made her sick. Still, she worked. She joined a veterans hospital, tending to wounded men returning from Europe in the Pacific. She never told them what she had endured. She only listened, comforted, and healed. Sometimes the patients would ask, "You were overseas, right? Was it bad?" She would smile gently. "Worse than you can imagine," she'd say. Then she'd walk away, her eyes filled with ghosts. One evening, she found a letter waiting for her. It was from the family of Helen, the nurse who had been beaten in the camp. They had heard Mary made it home. They wanted to know if Helen had suffered. Mary sat by the window, holding the paper for a long time. Then she wrote back. She was brave. She never stopped believing we'd make it home. Years passed. The war faded into history, but Mary never sought recognition. It wasn't until 1951 that the government finally honored the surviving nurses, the angels of Bataan. Medals were pinned to thin chests, hands shook, cameras flashed. When it was her turn, the officer said, "Lieutenant Harrington, you showed extraordinary courage." She looked at him and quietly replied, "We were just doing our job." But that night, alone in her small apartment, she opened a box of old photographs. Pictures from before the war, smiling faces, bright uniforms, Manila beaches, sunlight. She traced their faces with her finger, whispering their names like a prayer. By the 1960s, she had begun to write again. Not about the horrors, but about the moments of grace. A stolen song in the dark, a shared crust of bread, a hand that refused to let go. She said those were the things that kept her human. In her final years, she would visit schools, telling children about kindness, not war. She would bring the faded nurse's cap she wore in Santo Tomas. She would ask, "See this? It's not a symbol of suffering. It's proof we never gave up." One student once asked her, "Were you ever afraid?" She smiled softly. "Every day," she said. "But fear isn't the enemy. giving up is. When she died in 1988, her personal trunk was donated to a war museum. Inside were the cigarette-paper journal pages, a rusted spoon, and a small photograph of the nurses standing together in 1945, thin, weak, but alive. On the back of the photo, in faded ink, she had written, "We endured because we had each other." Today, historians call them pioneers, the first American women ever held as prisoners of war. But to those who knew their story, they were something more. They were proof that compassion could survive even in the darkest corners of humanity. And though their names rarely appear in textbooks, their legacy lives on in every medic, every nurse, every soul who chooses to heal in the face of pain. Because in the end, the angels of Bataan were not remembered for what they suffered, but how they refused to let the world forget what courage looks like.